A struggling mechanic opens his garage door to a terrified pregnant woman seeking refuge, unaware she carries evidence that could expose a powerful criminal network. When a corrupt police officer comes knocking, the mechanic must make a choice: protect her and risk everything, or turn her away and live with the guilt. What follows is a gripping tale of courage, betrayal, and the fight for justice against impossible odds. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The morning sun peeked through the gray clouds, casting a faint glow over the small, rundown neighborhood where Jack, a 32-year-old mechanic, lived and worked. His one-room home sat above the modest garage he rented, its cracked walls and rusted metal sheets a testament to the hardships he had endured. The place smelled of grease and gasoline, and the faint sound of clanging tools could often be heard well into the night. Jack's life was simple, but far from easy. Each day began before sunrise as he rolled up the garage door, welcoming whatever work the day might bring. His fingers, calloused from years of hard labor, moved deftly over the worn tools he'd inherited from his father. The town's residents trusted him not only for his skills, but for his honesty. Jack never overcharged, even when he desperately needed the money. The town itself was a picture of faded potential. Once thriving with small businesses and bustling markets, it now bore the scars of neglect. Broken streetlights and pothole-filled roads stretched across the neighborhood, a grim reflection of its residents' lives. The few shops that remained open struggled under the weight of high taxes and protection fees, demanded by a corrupt local police officer, Inspector Pradhan. Inspector Pradhan ruled the area with an iron fist, exploiting the vulnerable with threats and fabricated charges. He was the kind of man who wore his uniform like a crown, his every move calculated to assert his power. The residents had learned to stay silent, too afraid to stand up against him. Jack had felt the sting of Pradhan's corruption more than once. Late payments on his garage rent had led to Pradhan harassing him with baseless fines, and yet Jack refused to compromise his integrity. He worked tirelessly, fixing broken engines and battered bikes, hoping to scrape together enough to keep the garage running. Despite his struggles, Jack was the kind of man who couldn't turn a blind eye to someone in need. Just that morning, he had seen a young boy struggling to carry a heavy bag of groceries. Without hesitation, Jack had left his tools to help, earning a shy but grateful smile from the child. On another occasion, a neighbor with a stalled scooter had knocked on his door late at night. Though he was bone-tired, Jack had spent an hour in the dark repairing the vehicle, refusing to accept any payment. "Pay me when you can," he'd said with a small smile, waving off the man's protests. His kindness wasn't born of wealth or abundance. It came from understanding. Jack knew what it felt like to struggle, to face each day unsure of what tomorrow would bring. He had lost his parents to illness in his early 20s and had taken on the responsibility of his younger sister's education. Though she was now married and living in another city, Jack still carried the weight of those years, his resilience forged in the fires of hardship. That morning, as Jack wiped the grease from his hands and leaned against the open garage door, he couldn't help but notice the unease in the air. A few shopkeepers were whispering nervously across the street, their eyes darting toward the corner where Inspector Pradhan's Jeep was parked. Pradhan stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel, and adjusted his belt with a flourish. His sharp eyes scanned the street like a predator surveying its prey. The mere sight of him was enough to send some residents scurrying back into their homes or shops, their heads bowed in fear. "Jack," Pradhan called out, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. "Still running this old junkyard? When will you learn there's no future in fixing scraps?" Jack clenched his jaw but forced a neutral expression. "Just doing my job, Inspector," he replied evenly, refusing to rise to the bait. Pradhan smirked, leaning against his Jeep. "Well, let me know when you find a real job. Or better yet, when you can finally pay those overdue fines. Wouldn't want this place shut down now, would we?" As Pradhan drove off, Jack exhaled, tension tightening in his chest. He knew the inspector's threats weren't idle. Pradhan thrived on exploiting people like him, those too honest to fight back and too poor to escape. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the day was far from over. Something was coming, something that would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the garage, Jack returned to work. unaware that a desperate woman was about to walk into his life and change it forever. The night was unnaturally quiet, save for the faint hum of crickets in the distance. Jack sat in his garage, finishing the last touches on a worn-out motorcycle under the dim light of a single bulb. His shoulders ached from the day's work, but he kept going, the rhythmic clinking of his tools filling the silence. Just as he began to pack up for the night, a sudden knock shattered the stillness. Jack looked up, his brow furrowing. It was well past closing hours, and visitors at this time usually meant trouble. He wiped his hands on a rag and approached the door cautiously. When he opened it, a woman stood on the threshold. She was visibly pregnant, her rounded belly cradled protectively by trembling hands. Her disheveled hair clung to her damp forehead, and her eyes darted nervously as though she expected someone to emerge from the shadows. Her dress, though modest, was stained with dirt, and her sandals were caked with mud, hinting at a long and hurried journey. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I need help." Jack stepped aside, his instincts kicking in before his mind could process the situation. "Come in," he said softly, gesturing to a wooden stool by his workbench. The woman hesitated, her wary eyes scanning the garage before finally stepping inside. As she sat, Jack noticed how tightly she clutched her small bag, as if it held her entire world. Her chest rose and fell with rapid breaths, and her fingers trembled as she adjusted the strap on her shoulder. "You look exhausted," Jack said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Would you like some water?" The woman nodded, her movements jerky. Jack poured her a glass from the jug he kept in the corner, watching as she drank it in hurried gulps. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice cracking. Jack crouched beside her, his tone gentle but probing. "Are you okay? Do you need a doctor?" Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "I'm fine. The baby is fine." She paused, struggling to find the right words. "I just need somewhere safe. Just for a little while." Jack studied her carefully. She was clearly terrified, but there was something else, a guardedness that hinted at secrets she wasn't ready to share. Still, her desperation was undeniable, and Jack couldn't bring himself to turn her away. "All right," he said finally. "You can stay here tonight. It's not much, but it's safe." The woman's shoulders sagged with relief, and for the first time her eyes softened. "Thank you," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. Jack moved quickly, grabbing a folded blanket from a shelf and clearing a spot on the cot he used for short naps during long shifts. "You can rest here," he said, motioning to the makeshift bed. "I'll lock the doors. No one will bother you." She hesitated before sitting down, the tension in her posture refusing to ease. Jack noticed her flinch when a dog barked faintly in the distance, her head snapping toward the sound. "You're safe here," Jack reassured her, but she didn't respond. As Jack prepared a simple meal of bread and lentils, he couldn't help but observe the woman closely. She ate in small, hurried bites, glancing toward the door every few moments as if expecting someone to burst through it. "You're not from around here, are you?" Jack asked, trying to ease the silence. She shook her head. I was passing through." "Long journey?" She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Yes, too long." Her cryptic answers only deepened Jack's curiosity, but he sensed pushing her for details would do more harm than good. Still, subtle clues spoke volumes. The faint bruise on her wrist she tried to hide, the way her hand trembled when she reached for the glass, and the small, tattered envelope that peeked out of her bag when she adjusted it on the cot. "Who are you running from?" Jack thought, but he didn't dare ask aloud. Instead, he handed her a pillow and said, "Get some rest. I'll be working here if you need anything." The woman hesitated before lying down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Jack noticed her clutching the strap of her bag, even in her sleep, her fingers curling around it as though letting go wasn't an option. As the hours passed, Jack returned to his workbench, the rhythmic clink of his tools filling the quiet again. But his thoughts kept drifting to the woman, to the fear in her eyes and the shadows she seemed to carry. He didn't know who she was or what danger she was fleeing, but one thing was certain. She was in trouble, and by offering her sanctuary, he might be inviting that trouble into his own life. For now, though, Jack pushed the thought aside. Whoever she was, whatever secrets she carried. She needed help. And if there was one thing Jack knew, it was how to stand by someone in need, no matter the cost. The air in the small neighborhood felt heavier the next morning, as though the arrival of daylight had done little to chase away the shadows lingering in Jack's garage. The woman still slept on the cot, her expression twitching with unease even in slumber. Jack stood by his workbench, his hands busy with a carburetor that needed fixing, but his mind preoccupied with questions he dared not voice. The quiet was shattered by the low, rumbling growl of a Jeep pulling up outside the garage. Jack glanced up, his stomach tightening. Only one person in the town drove a vehicle that sounded like authority itself. Inspector Pradhan. Pradhan stepped out of the Jeep with a theatrical air, his polished boots crunching against the gravel. His uniform was spotless, the sharp creases on his sleeves a stark contrast to the unkempt streets he ruled over. With his thick mustache and piercing gaze, he had the kind of presence that made people shrink away without needing to speak a word. He wasn't a man to be crossed. The inspector's power didn't lie in his badge but in the way he used it, twisting the law to suit his whims and crushing anyone who dared to challenge him. He thrived on intimidation, and his reputation as a merciless enforcer made him the undisputed ruler of this small, impoverished town. Jack braced himself as Pradhan approached, the heavy thud of his boots growing louder with each step. Pradhan stopped just outside the garage, his cold eyes scanning the space with the precision of a hawk spotting prey. His lips curled into a smirk as he took in the sight of Jack, standing in his grease-stained overalls, his tools clutched in one hand. "Ah, Jack," Pradhan drawled, his voice dripping with mock cordiality. "Burning the midnight oil again, are we? Or perhaps entertaining visitors?" Jack's grip on his wrench tightened, but he kept his face neutral. "Just work, Inspector. That's all I do." Pradhan stepped into the garage, his gaze lingering on the cot in the corner. The blanket was neatly folded now, but the faint impression of where the woman had slept was still visible. "I'm looking for someone," Pradhan said, circling the garage with deliberate slowness. "A woman, pregnant, dark hair. She may have passed through here last night. Seen anyone like that?" Jack's heart pounded, but he forced himself to remain calm. "No, sir," he replied evenly. "Haven't seen anyone." Pradhan stopped in front of Jack, his smirk fading into something sharper, more dangerous. "You're a good mechanic, Jack. Honest, hard-working. But honesty can be inconvenient, don't you think? Especially if it gets in the way of the law." Jack met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "I don't know what you're talking about, Inspector. I'm just trying to do my job." The tension in the air was palpable, but Jack stood his ground. He knew how Pradhan operated, using fear to bend people to his will. And though Jack wasn't a man who sought out conflict, he wasn't about to betray someone who had come to him for help, no matter how little he knew about her. Pradhan leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "I'd think very carefully about my next words if I were you, Jack. Harboring a fugitive is a serious crime. And in a place like this, who would miss a small-time mechanic if he disappeared?" Jack's pulse quickened, but he refused to back down. "I already told you, Inspector. I haven't seen anyone." Pradhan straightened, his smirk returning, but his eyes burned with menace. "You're either very brave or very foolish," he said, his tone icy. "Let's hope for your sake that it's not the latter." Satisfied he had made his point, Pradhan turned and walked back toward his Jeep. Before climbing in, he called over his shoulder, his voice casual but loaded with implication. "I'll be watching, Jack. And if I find out you've been lying to me..." He let the threat hang in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. As the Jeep roared to life and drove away, Jack exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands trembled slightly as he set down the wrench, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. He glanced toward the cot, where the woman now stood, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She had overheard everything. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to bring this trouble to you." Jack shook his head, his resolve hardening. "It's not your fault," he said firmly. "That man doesn't scare me." But as he returned to his work, his mind raced with possibilities. He didn't know who this woman was or what she was running from, but one thing was certain. Inspector Pradhan wasn't going to back down. And if Jack wasn't careful, he could lose everything. The quiet hum of the evening settled over the garage, the distant sound of crickets blending with the occasional clang of tools. Jack sat at his workbench, pretending to be engrossed in fixing a carburetor. But his mind was on the woman sitting silently in the corner. She hadn't said much since Inspector Pradhan's visit earlier in the day, and the weight of her silence hung heavily in the air. She cradled her belly protectively, her eyes fixed on the floor. Jack noticed how she traced small circles on her stomach with trembling fingers, as if silently reassuring the baby within. The sight tugged at something deep inside him. Finally, breaking the stillness, Jack spoke, his voice gentle. "You don't have to tell me everything, but you should know you're safe here." The woman glanced up, her dark eyes wary but touched with gratitude. "Safe," she murmured, almost to herself. "I don't even know what that feels like anymore." She hesitated, her hands tightening around her belly. "My name's Mira," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not from here. I've been running for weeks now." Jack put down his tools, turning his full attention to her. "Running from who?" Mira shook her head, a shadow crossing her face. "I can't say, not yet. The less you know, the safer you'll be." Jack leaned back on his stool, his arms crossed but his expression open. "Maybe. But that doesn't mean I can't try to help. Whatever you're afraid of, you don't have to face it alone." Mira's lips quivered, and she looked away quickly, blinking back tears. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking. "If they find me, they'll take everything from me. My baby. They'll take my baby." The words spilled out before she could stop them, and once they did, she seemed powerless to hold back the flood of emotion. Her shoulders shook as the tears came, silent but raw. Jack reached for a clean rag and offered it to her, his movements careful and unhurried. Mira hesitated for a moment before taking it, pressing it to her face as she sobbed quietly. "I've done everything I can to protect her," she said between shaky breaths. "But I'm so tired. Every step feels heavier than the last. I can't keep running, but I don't know how to stop." Her words hit Jack like a hammer. He didn't know the full story, but her fear and exhaustion were palpable. He could see the toll it had taken, the dark circles under her eyes, the hollowness in her cheeks. And yet there was something fierce in the way she spoke of her baby, a determination that shone through her pain. "You're stronger than you think," Jack said softly. "It takes strength to keep going, even when you're scared." Mira looked at him, her tears slowing. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion and wonder. "You don't even know me." Jack smiled faintly, his gaze steady. "Maybe I see a little of myself in you, and I know what it's like to feel like the world's against you." For the first time, Jack let himself share a piece of his own story. "After my parents died, it was just me and my younger sister. I had no money, no one to turn to, and every day felt like a fight just to survive. People like Pradhan, people with power, they made sure I knew how small I was." He paused, his jaw tightening at the memory. "But I had someone to fight for. My sister. She was my reason to keep going, even when it felt impossible." Mira listened intently, her expression softening. "What happened to her?" "She's doing well now," Jack said with a small smile. "She's married, has a family of her own. I'd like to think I did something right by her. But back then, if someone hadn't stepped in to help me when I needed it most..." He shook his head. "Let's just say I wouldn't be here today." He looked at Mira, his eyes full of quiet determination. "That's why I'm helping you. Because everyone deserves someone in their corner. Especially when the fight isn't fair." Mira's grip on her bag loosened slightly, the tension in her posture easing. For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked at Jack not with suspicion, but with cautious trust. "I don't know what's waiting for me on the other side of this," she said, her voice steadier now. "But thank you, for not asking too many questions, for just being here." Jack nodded. "One step at a time. We'll figure it out." As the night wore on, the silence between them grew less heavy, less guarded. For Mira, it was the first glimmer of hope she'd felt in weeks. For Jack, it was a reminder of why he had always chosen kindness, even when it came at a cost. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment, they had found something rare. A connection forged not by circumstance, but by the shared belief that even in the darkest times, compassion could make all the difference. The rain outside Jack's garage drummed steadily against the tin roof, filling the silence between him and Mira. She sat on the cot, her fingers twisting the edge of her scarf as though it was the only thing anchoring her to the room. Her face was pale, her shoulders slumped under the weight of something she had carried for far too long. Jack stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, concern etched into his features. "Mira," he said gently, "if you're in danger, I need to know what we're dealing with. Pradhan isn't going to give up, and the longer you stay quiet, the harder this gets. For both of us." Her eyes darted to the door, then back to Jack. "I never wanted to drag you into this," she whispered. "I thought, if I could just keep moving, they'd lose track of me. But now—" She paused, her voice trembling. "There's no point in running anymore." Mira's hands trembled as she reached for the small, tattered bag she had clung to so fiercely since the day she arrived. She opened it slowly, revealing a bundle of papers, neatly folded but worn at the edges. Her gaze stayed fixed on them, as though the sight alone brought back memories she wished she could forget. "I was married to a man named Anil," she began, her voice barely audible. "He wasn't always the man he became. When we met, he was kind, ambitious, and full of dreams. But somewhere along the way, his ambitions turned into greed." She looked up at Jack, her eyes glistening with tears. "He became involved in things, smuggling, bribery, and worse. At first I told myself I didn't know, that it wasn't my business. But then I saw the truth. He was powerful, untouchable, and his hands were in everything corrupt in this town." Jack frowned, the pieces starting to fall into place. "And Pradhan? He works for Anil," she said, her voice sharp with anger. "Not officially, of course, but he's one of Anil's most trusted men, his enforcer. Pradhan covers up his crimes, silences anyone who gets too close to exposing him." Jack's stomach sank as he thought of Pradhan's earlier threats, the smug confidence that came with knowing he controlled the town. "And you?" he asked quietly. Mira swallowed hard, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I couldn't look the other way anymore. I found records, transactions, deals, everything. I thought if I took them to the right people I could stop him. I was wrong." Her hands tightened around the papers. "When Anil found out, he didn't hesitate. He sent Pradhan and his men after me. I barely escaped. I've been running ever since." The weight of Mira's words hung heavy in the air. Jack stared at the papers in her lap, realizing that they weren't just evidence. They were a death sentence for anyone caught with them. "You're saying those could bring down Anil?" Jack asked, nodding toward the papers. Mira nodded. "If they get to the right people, yes. But if Pradhan finds them, or me, it's over. Anil will make sure no one ever hears the truth." Jack exhaled, running a hand through his hair. The magnitude of what he had stepped into hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just about helping a pregnant woman in need. This was about exposing a powerful criminal network, one that wouldn't hesitate to crush anyone who stood in its way. "You're carrying a ticking time bomb," Jack said, his voice low. "And Pradhan knows it." Mira nodded, tears spilling over her cheeks. "I thought, if I could just survive long enough to give birth, maybe I'd have a chance. But now I don't know. I don't know how to keep her safe." Jack knelt in front of her, his voice firm but compassionate. "Mira, listen to me. You're not alone anymore. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The words came easily, but the weight behind them was crushing. Jack had spent his whole life fighting small battles, scraping together rent, standing up to bullies like Pradhan, and keeping his dignity intact in a world that seemed determined to break him. But this was something far bigger, far more dangerous. Still, the thought of turning Mira away never crossed his mind. She wasn't just another victim. She was a fighter, a mother-to-be risking everything for her child's future. And if she was willing to stand up to men like Anil and Pradhan, how could he do any less? "You're risking your life for what's right," Jack said. "How can I walk away from that?" Mira stared at him, her lips trembling. "You don't have to do this, Jack. They'll come for you, too." Jack smiled faintly, his resolve hardening. "Let them. I've faced worse odds before. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that standing up for what's right isn't about being fearless. It's about doing it anyway. Jack picked up the papers, skimming through them quickly. The names, dates, and transactions were damning, enough to dismantle Anil's empire if they reached the right hands. But getting them there would be no easy task. We'll need to move carefully, Jack said, his mind racing. I know someone who might help. A journalist. Someone who doesn't answer to people like Anil. If we can get these to him, we might stand a chance. Mira's eyes widened. You'd do that? You'd risk everything? Jack met her gaze, his expression unwavering. If we don't, who will? The sun had barely risen when the rumble of approaching vehicles broke the stillness of the morning. Jack froze mid-turn of a wrench, the familiar sound of Inspector Predon's jeep sending a chill down his spine. As the noise grew louder, Mira emerged from the corner of the garage, her face pale and tense. They've found me, she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack glanced at the garage's open doors, the narrow street outside already echoing with the screech of tires. His mind raced. Stay calm, he said firmly. We're not done yet. Pradhan's jeep roared into view, flanked by 2 motorcycles. The officers dismounted, their movements calculated and menacing. Pradhan stepped out last, his polished boots crunching against the gravel as he surveyed the garage with a predator's gleam in his eyes. Jack! Pradhan barked, his voice sharp and commanding. You've been hiding something from me, haven't you? Jack stepped forward, his expression neutral, but his heart pounding. I told you before, Inspector. I don't know anything. Pradhan smirked, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Oh, you don't know anything. Then why does it smell like desperation in here? He gestured toward his men, who immediately began circling the garage like wolves on the hunt. Inside, Mira hid behind a stack of tires, clutching her bag of damning evidence. Her breaths were shallow, her heart hammering against her chest. Jack needed a plan, and fast. The garage was small, with limited exits, but he knew every inch of the place like the back of his hand. He also knew the alleys and back streets of the neighborhood, a labyrinth Pradhan's men wouldn't navigate as easily. He turned back to the officer, stalling for time. What exactly are you looking for, Inspector? Jack asked, his tone casual. Another excuse to write me a fine? Pradhan's eyes narrowed. Don't play games with me. If I find out you're lying, it'll be the last mistake you make. While Pradhan spoke, Jack subtly moved toward the workbench, where his toolbox sat open. Inside, he spotted the keys to an old pickup truck he'd been repairing for a client. The truck wasn't in perfect condition, but it would run, and it was their best shot at escaping. Jack raised his voice, drawing Pradhan's attention back to him. You know, Inspector, for someone who talks a lot about law and order, you seem awfully comfortable breaking it yourself. Pradhan's face darkened. Careful, mechanic. You're not as clever as you think. The moment Pradhan turned to bark orders at his men, Jack sprang into action. He grabbed the keys and darted toward the truck parked at the rear of the garage. Mira, he called out in a low voice. Get in the truck, now. Mira bolted from her hiding spot, clutching her bag tightly as she ran toward the vehicle. The sound of her movement caught the attention of one of Pradhan's men, who shouted, She's here! Chaos erupted. Jack jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door just as Mira climbed into the passenger side. The engine roared to life, coughing and sputtering before settling into a rough but steady rhythm. Stop them, Pradhan shouted, his voice cutting through the commotion. The truck lurched forward, its tires screeching against the gravel as Jack slammed his foot on the accelerator. Behind them, the motorcycles roared to life, chasing after them with relentless speed. The narrow streets of the neighborhood became a battleground. Jack swerved sharply to avoid a pile of crates, the truck groaning under the strain. Mira clutched the dashboard, her knuckles white. They're gaining on us, she cried. Not for long, Jack said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He took a sharp turn down an alley barely wide enough for the truck, the side mirrors scraping against the walls. The motorcycles hesitated at the entrance, giving Jack a precious few seconds to put more distance between them. But the reprieve didn't last long. Pradhan's jeep barreled into view from the other end of the alley, blocking their path. Jack slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just inches from the vehicle. Pradhan stepped out of the jeep, his gun drawn. "It's over, Jack," he shouted. "Hand her over, and maybe I'll go easy on you." Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his mind racing. Mira's breathing was ragged beside him, her bag clutched like a lifeline. "No deal," Jack said, his voice steady despite the odds stacked against them. Pradhan smirked, his men closing in from behind. "Do you really think you can win this? You're just a mechanic. This isn't your fight." Jack stepped out of the truck, holding a crowbar he'd grabbed from the floorboard. "Maybe not," he said, his gaze unwavering. "But someone has to stand up to bullies like you." The two men stared each other down, the air crackling with tension. Pradhan's finger twitched on the trigger, but before he could act, the faint wail of a distant siren pierced the air. Pradhan's smirk faltered. "What did you do?" he hissed. Jack allowed himself a small smile. "I called someone who doesn't answer to you." The approaching police vehicle, one from a neighboring jurisdiction, screeched to a halt nearby. A senior officer stepped out, his badge gleaming. "Inspector Pradhan," he said coldly. "We need to talk." The garage was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the standoff. The only sounds were Jack's labored breathing and the faint wail of sirens fading into the distance. Mira sat on a wooden stool, her hands trembling as she held the bag containing the evidence she had risked everything to protect. The chaos of the chase and confrontation had left her shaken, but now a new resolve flickered in her eyes. "It's time," she said, her voice low but steady. Jack, leaning against his workbench, wiped a trickle of sweat from his brow. "Time for what?" "To end this," Mira replied. She reached into the bag and pulled out a neatly folded stack of papers, along with a small flash drive. Her hands still shook, but her gaze was unwavering. "These documents, they show everything. The illegal deals, the bribes, the threats. It's all here. And this," she held up the flash drive. "It's a recording of a meeting between Anil and Pradhan. They admitted everything, even laughed about how untouchable they thought they were." Jack's eyes widened as he took in the weight of what she was saying. "This could bring them down," he said, his voice filled with cautious hope. "But we'll need to get it to someone who can actually use it." Mira nodded. "There's a journalist I know, Rajat Mehra. He's been trying to expose Anil for years, but he's always been blocked by people like Pradhan. If we get this to him, he'll make sure the truth comes out." Her words carried a quiet determination that belied the fear still etched into her face. Jack could see how much this fight had cost her, how deeply the sacrifices had cut. Yet she refused to back down. "You're brave, Mira," Jack said softly. "Braver than most people I've ever met." She gave him a faint smile, though tears glistened in her eyes. "I'm just a mother trying to protect her child. If I have to fight monsters to do that, I will." As they finalized their plan, Jack realized the risks involved. Getting the evidence to Rajat would mean walking straight into the lion's den. Pradhan and his men were still out there, likely watching for their next move. But Jack's resolve only strengthened. "We can't go directly to him," Jack said, pacing the garage. "Pradhan will have every major road and checkpoint covered, but I know another way." Mira looked at him curiously. "What way?" "There's an old service road just outside the town," Jack explained. "It's overgrown, barely usable. Pradhan's men won't think to look there. I'll take you as far as I can. Once we're past the checkpoints, we'll contact Rajat and arrange a meeting." Mira hesitated, the weight of her trust in him evident in her expression. "You've already done so much, Jack. Are you sure about this? If they catch us—" "They won't," Jack interrupted firmly. "And even if they do, I'm not letting them win. Not this time." The journey to the service road was tense but uneventful. Jack and Mira navigated the twisting paths, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main roads. When they finally reached the rendezvous point, a nondescript car pulled up, and Rajat stepped out. He was a middle-aged man with a weary but determined air, his bag slung over one shoulder. Mira handed him the evidence, her hands steady now. "This is everything," she said. "If you publish this, it'll expose Anil, Pradhan, and everyone involved." Rajat studied the documents and the flash drive, his expression hardening. "This is enough to tear their entire network apart," he said. "But once this goes live, they'll come after you, both of you." Mira straightened her back, her fear replaced by a quiet resolve. Let them. I've been running for too long. It's time they face the consequences. Jack nodded, standing beside her. We'll be ready. Within hours, the story broke. Rajat's publication released the documents and recordings, accompanied by a scathing exposé of Anil's criminal empire and Pradhan's role in protecting it. The news spread like wildfire, and by nightfall, the fallout began. Pradhan's face appeared on every news channel, no longer as a feared enforcer, but as a disgraced officer under investigation. Protesters gathered outside the police station, demanding justice, while higher authorities launched a full-scale inquiry into the corruption that had plagued the town for years. By the next morning, Pradhan was arrested, his smirk replaced by a sullen glare as cameras captured his walk of shame. Anil's influence began to crumble, his associates abandoning him in the wake of the scandal. Back at the garage, Jack and Mira watched the news unfold on an old TV. Mira's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of relief. "It's over," she whispered, her hand resting on her belly. "We're finally free." Jack smiled, a rare warmth lighting his face. "You did it," he said. "You faced them and won." Mira looked at him, gratitude shining in her eyes. "We did it, Jack. I couldn't have done this without you." As the rain began to fall outside, washing away the remnants of the night's tension, the two sat in silence, the weight of their victory settling in. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they could finally breathe. The morning after Pradhan's arrest, the town buzzed with a new energy. For the first time in years, people walked the streets with a sense of relief, their usual wariness replaced by cautious optimism. At the heart of this quiet revolution was Jack's garage, no longer just a place for fixing engines, but now a symbol of resistance and bravery. Jack stood outside the garage, the scent of rain lingering in the air. He watched as a small group of neighbors gathered near his gate, their faces filled with admiration. "You're a hero, Jack," one of them said, their voice brimming with gratitude. "If it weren't for you, we'd still be living under Pradhan's shadow." Jack waved off the praise, a modest smile on his face. "I just did what anyone should do," he said. But deep down, he felt a sense of pride he hadn't known in years. The events of the past week had changed everything for Jack. Word of his courage spread quickly, and his garage, once barely scraping by, was now bustling with new customers. People from neighboring towns brought their vehicles to him, not just for his skills, but for the reputation he had earned as a man who stood up for what was right. For the first time in years, Jack felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. The steady flow of work meant he could finally pay off his debts and even start thinking about expanding the garage. It wasn't just his livelihood that had grown. It was his sense of purpose. As he tightened the last bolt on a customer's motorcycle, he caught sight of Mira standing by the garage entrance, a faint smile on her face. Mira approached Jack, her bag slung over her shoulder, her posture more relaxed than he had ever seen. She still carried the exhaustion of her journey, but now it was tempered by hope. "Leaving already?" Jack asked, setting down his tools. Mira nodded, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "It's time," she said. "Rajat arranged a safe place for me, somewhere far from here." Jack nodded, though he couldn't hide the pang of sadness at seeing her go. "You'll be all right," he said. "You're stronger than you think." Mira stepped closer, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Jack, I don't have the words to thank you for everything you've done. You didn't just save me, you gave my child a chance at a future." Jack smiled faintly. "Just promise me one thing," he said. "Teach your little one to be as brave as their mother." Mira laughed softly, tears rolling down her cheeks. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "It's not much," she said, pressing it into his hands. "But it's my way of saying thank you. Use it to make your life better. You deserve that much." Jack opened the envelope later that evening, finding enough money to cover his overdue expenses and then some. But more than the financial help, it was Mira's gesture that stayed with him, a reminder of the ripple effect of kindness. As the days turned into weeks, Jack's life began to take on a new rhythm. The garage, once a symbol of his struggles, now stood as a beacon of hope for the community. Customers came not just for repairs, but for the stories of the mechanic who had faced down corruption and won. Mira's story became a quiet legend, passed from neighbor to neighbor. And though she was gone, her impact lingered, proof that even in the darkest times, courage and resilience could light the way. For Jack, the experience was more than a chapter in his life. It was a lesson in the power of standing up for what's right. He had faced fear, uncertainty, and danger, but through it all, he had held on to his values. One evening, as he stood outside his garage watching the sunset, he thought of the journey that had brought him here. The faces of the people he had helped, the risks he had taken, and the trust he had built. It all came together in a single, undeniable truth. Even the smallest acts of goodness could create extraordinary outcomes. Jack wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was proof that one person's courage could inspire change, that kindness could triumph over fear, and that standing up for what was right was always worth it. And as the town moved forward, Jack knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. This powerful story of courage, kindness, and standing up against corruption shows how even small acts of bravery can change lives. If this tale inspired you, share it with someone who believes in the power of doing what's right. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that prove heroes can come from the most unexpected places. What would you do in their shoes?